Sarah Yarborough arrived at the parking lot of her school on the morning of December 14, 1991. She was heading to a sporting event with her cheerleading team and planned to meet the others at the school building. However, after she parked her car, she vanished without a trace. Soon, a chilling discovery would shock everyone, and the police were called in to investigate. It took detectives a full 28 years to uncover the truth behind her disappearance. The case would go on to become one of the most disturbing and complex mysteries law enforcement had ever faced. Sarah Yarborough was born on June 12, 1975, in Portland, Oregon. Her family later moved to Federal Way, Washington, a suburb near Seattle. Sarah had two younger brothers and was very close to them, often helping her parents care for them. From a young age, Sarah was known for her dedication to school, particularly her passion for music and ballet. She was also an active member of her high school's cheerleading team and had many friends. Sarah was kind-hearted and always eager to help anyone in need. On that fateful Saturday morning in December 1991, Sarah, age 16, was preparing for an event with her cheerleading team. They were supposed to gather at the school building, where a bus would pick them up. Sarah, however, mistakenly thought the bus would arrive at 8 a.m., but it was actually scheduled for 9 a.m. As a result, Sarah arrived early, taking her father's car to the school. By the time her friends began arriving, none of them saw Sarah. Some students did spot her car in the parking lot, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. Even when the bus arrived, there was no sign of her. Concern began to grow, but since it was 1991 and no one had cell phones, contacting her proved difficult. Around the same time, two 12-year-old boys who were walking near the school's tennis courts passed through a wooded area behind the school. They saw a strange man emerge from the bushes, look at them, and walk in the opposite direction. They thought nothing of it at the time, but when they got a few more feet down the path, they made a shocking discovery: a girl lying on the ground, unresponsive. They initially thought she was dead. The boys ran home to tell their parents, and one of the fathers went with his son to investigate the scene. The other father decided to follow the suspicious man the boys had seen. The boy mentioned that the man's car looked like a Chevrolet Nova. The father tried to track down the car but lost sight of it quickly. Meanwhile, the parents of the other boy who had discovered the body arrived at the scene. They immediately called the police, who confirmed that the girl was indeed dead. From the marks on her neck, it was clear that Sarah had been strangled. Her purse, car keys, and other belongings were found inside her car in the school parking lot, suggesting that the attack likely took place near the car. Medical experts stated that there were no traces of male semen on Sarah Yarborough's body, and no signs of sexual violence were found. With this information in hand, investigators began to form a theory about what happened. Sarah arrived at school almost an hour earlier than required, and there was no one else in the parking lot except her. The attacker likely noticed her alone and waited for her to get out of the car. He then struck her on the head with some object, rendering Sarah unconscious. He dragged her from the parking lot to the woods behind the school, where her body would later be found. The criminal removed some of her clothes and committed lewd acts on her before strangling her with her own stockings. When one of the children who discovered Sarah's body mentioned the car the criminal may have used to flee, detectives put a Chevrolet Nova on their wanted list. They quickly located it, but it turned out the driver was delivering donuts that morning. After he provided his DNA sample, it did not match the one found on Sarah's clothes. The boys who saw the car had simply noticed a vehicle passing by, and mistakenly assumed it was the suspect's car. None of the children could remember seeing the man approach a car, or anything specific that would lead investigators to the perpetrator. In the following days, the police continued to search for new witnesses and leads, but nothing significant emerged. When school resumed, the students were horrified by the crime, especially since it had taken place just a few meters from their school. The murderer was still at large, and the girls were afraid to walk around the school grounds alone. To ensure safety, the boys from the sports teams agreed to escort students to their cars or buses. Detectives interviewed approximately 70 potential witnesses who were in and around the school that morning. They compiled a rough composite of the suspect based on the descriptions of the two boys and the runner who had seen the man near the body. The police released the composite sketch to local newspapers and television stations, and the media actively covered the case. Over the next several weeks, the police received hundreds of tips, but all of them led to dead ends. At one point, a tip came in about a man who fit the description of the killer and had a criminal history. However, his DNA did not match the sample found on Sarah's clothes. Investigators tried to work through over 4,000 different tips, but with limited resources they struggled to keep up. The case began to stall. In the face of dwindling resources, Sarah's family, determined to help, took matters into their own hands. Sarah's grandfather worked for a technology company and convinced the management to loan the police a powerful computer worth $150,000, a huge amount in the 90s. With the new technology, the police could store and process the leads faster. However, despite these efforts, no new leads emerged, and the case went cold again. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated and decided to memorialize their friend. They raised enough money to create a memorial, a bench with some of Sarah's belongings placed on it. A metal cast of Sarah's dog reaching for her purse was also added to the memorial. Over the following years, the case was periodically reopened. All available evidence was re-examined, but there was no progress. The police interviewed thousands of people and took DNA samples from almost 300 suspects, but all of them were ruled out. In 2011, 2 decades after Sarah's death, a new detective took the case and decided to explore modern technologies to find the killer. He reached out to a company specializing in genetic genealogy and asked if they could try to identify the relatives of the person whose DNA had been found on Sarah's body. At the time, genetic genealogy was in its early stages, and experts faced significant limitations. They could only search for relatives on the male side if they had male DNA, and vice versa. Additionally, legal restrictions prohibited the use of genetic data samples to search for distant relatives of a suspected individual. However, the effort produced some intriguing results. The researchers discovered that the killer's DNA was related to someone who had descended from Robert Fuller, a passenger on the Mayflower ship that had sailed to America in 1620. Unfortunately, tracking the DNA back through 25 million descendants of the Mayflower passengers was an enormous challenge. The detective didn't realize that this case was the first of its kind to be investigated using genetic genealogy. The detective did not give up. He located several men with the surname Fuller living in the area at the time of the murder. He obtained photographs of these men and showed them to the witnesses, the 2 boys who discovered Sarah's body, and the runner who had seen the man near the scene. Unfortunately, none of the witnesses recognized the killer in the photos. The detective then asked for DNA samples from all the Fullers in the area. These were sent to the lab, and although the match wasn't found in this group, something interesting emerged. It turned out that one of the men was indeed a distant relative of Robert Fuller, but he was not the killer. The criminal could have been related to him through a distant connection that the families were unaware of. In 2017, after years of tireless effort, the detective retired, and the case remained unresolved. The case was transferred to a new team of investigators. They recontacted the company that had started studying the killer's DNA sample back in 2011. By that time, advancements in genetic technology had made significant progress. The experts agreed to try tracing the ancestry of the criminal using the DNA sample. It took 2 full years of painstaking work, as experts used public genetic databases to find even the most distant relatives of the killer. They manually traced family connections to find people who lived in Federal Way around the time of Sarah's murder. After filtering through several thousand people, they finally caught a break. The experts determined that the DNA from Sarah's clothing most likely belonged to one of two brothers. One of them was 33 years old at the time of the murder, and the other was 27. The older brother had a criminal history and had been in prison for violent crimes. His DNA was already in the FBI database, which meant he could be ruled out as the killer. The younger brother, Patrick Nicholas, had also come to the attention of the police multiple times for violent crimes, including offenses against minors. However, his DNA had not yet been entered into the system, as these crimes had occurred before the DNA of criminals began to be collected for databases. Detectives immediately began surveillance on Patrick, who was now 55 years old and living in a neighboring town called Wellington. They tracked his movements for 2 days. On one of those days, Patrick went to a laundromat. While waiting for his clothes, he stepped outside to smoke and dropped his cigarette butt on the ground. One of the officers quickly collected it as evidence. Later, while smoking a second cigarette, Patrick accidentally dropped a handkerchief from his pocket. The officer collected this as well. The next day, forensic experts were able to extract DNA from both the cigarette butt and the handkerchief. The results were a complete match with the DNA found on Sarah's clothing in 1991. A judge immediately issued an arrest warrant for Patrick and he was taken into custody. The entire process, from first learning his name to his arrest, took just 5 days. When Patrick's biography was leaked to the media, many people were shocked. Why had he never been considered a suspect over the past 28 years? It turned out that Patrick had a long criminal history. When he was 19, he approached a young girl, got into her car and tried to assault her. The victim managed to escape by jumping into a river and swimming to safety. Patrick was sentenced to 4 years in prison for this crime. In 1994, Patrick was arrested again after attempting to assault an underage girl. However, because the crime he was charged with wasn't considered severe enough at the time, his DNA sample was never entered into the database. This strange oversight allowed him to remain undetected for decades. It was only thanks to genetic genealogy that Patrick was finally identified as the killer. Experts in the field were unable to trace him through the Robert Fuller line, which had been explored earlier, because it turned out Patrick's biological grandfather had been adopted and he had grown up under a different family name. One of the men who had discovered Sarah's body in 1991, when he was only 12 years old, immediately recognized Patrick as the killer. This witness had been haunted by the face of the murderer for years, living in fear that he would one day come after him. But after Patrick's arrest, he finally felt safe. Patrick's trial began in 2023, more than 30 years after Sarah's murder. He maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, and his lawyer attempted to challenge the DNA evidence. The defense argued that the presence of semen on Sarah's clothes didn't prove guilt. They also tried to dispute the accuracy of the DNA analysis itself. However, the experts dismissed these claims, stating that the evidence was irrefutable. In the end, Patrick was found guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to 45 years and 8 months in prison, effectively ensuring that he would never be released. When the verdict was announced, Patrick showed no emotion, in stark contrast to Sarah's family, who spoke before the judge. They expressed their gratitude to everyone involved in the case, especially the researchers who helped bring the killer to justice, despite him evading justice for 28 years.